really excited to talk about retirement resolutions, make it easy for the new year. Obviously, it's a fitting time early in the year to talk about goal setting and common errors to avoid. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. A little bit about our firm. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about why I love my firm and why Dave loves this firm as well. We do everything in-house. All of our investment management decisions are made entirely with our investment management team. We've been working with the investment management team for years. It's a phone call to an internal person. I'm not reaching out to a different part of the state. I'm not talking to outside managers. We have our own team in-house. While we are a large firm, we have a very small feel. You work with a specific investment team, you work with a specific advisory team, you get to know your advisor, your client relationship specialist. It's not every time you call in, it's a toll-free number and you get a different person. And I think by having that small feel, you get to see the transparency, you get to see the holistic approach, you get to get that top tier service. Real quick, my name is Bryson Roof. I've been with Fort Pitt since 2012. I love working with clients to help them figure out what their goals are, find creative solutions. Outside of the office, I love spending time with my daughter, spend a lot of time with my beagles. I train beagles and trial them through the American Kennel Club. I've actually just judged my 49th trial at the AKC, so I'm looking forward to hitting that milestone of 50.
My name is David Plante. I've been with the firm now for about a little over 6 months, with about 30 years of investment experience in the financial services industry. Originally from Salem, Massachusetts, and relocated to central PA back in 2014 with a former firm. Really enjoy getting out there, getting outside, doing some camping. Spending time with my two boys that are now much older than his daughter, Brooke, and grilling and smoking various briskets and so forth. It's a great way to spend a weekend.
Real quick, since some of this may be new for you with using Zoom instead of GoToMeeting, here's how you can interact with us. So if you're on a mobile device on the far right side of the screen, you'll be able to see how to interact. Right down here, there's the question answer. I do have that tab open. I will be monitoring that as we go through. So ask any questions that you may have. If you are on a computer, the question answer is very similar. It's at the bottom. You can see, you can interact with us there. Again, I'll be monitoring any questions that come in during this webinar. So with that, Dave, do you maybe want to kick things off?
Yeah, so as Bryson was saying at the very beginning, this is a great topic because what happens in December 31st and January 1st, a lot of people start making their New Year's resolutions, and a lot of those tend to be financial. So what we thought was appropriate is, rather than go over some of the resolutions, we wanted to go over maybe some common mistakes or things people don't necessarily think about, when it comes to their overall wealth plan. The first topic, we started with estate planning mistakes. And, Bryson, I know you've been doing this for quite a while. What's one of the, you can all see the bullet points, but what is a mistake that you see with not having the plan and especially not updating beneficiaries?
Yeah, I think I have a couple of different stories that I can share to kind of solidify what we're talking about with not having an estate plan or not updating beneficiaries. Actually, this occurred when I was working with a firm down in Virginia Beach, and a gentleman had created a financial plan with us, had some life insurance, and he actually deployed overseas. He was in the Army. And unfortunately, when he returned home, he was in a car accident and passed away. And unfortunately, what he did not do was keep in contact with us. He would not have his annual reviews. So he left his beneficiary designation to his ex-girlfriend. He had since been married, had a child, and when the insurance company went to pay out to the beneficiary, the will and estate plan said that everything goes to his current wife and his daughter. but the beneficiary on the life insurance was listed as his ex-girlfriend. So the insurance company paid out to the ex-girlfriend. The wife and child really needed that income to offset the lack of him earning a salary anymore. And so she was looking at potentially suing the ex-girlfriend, and she actually consulted with us and then also her attorney. And the attorney said, unfortunately, there is enough case law that a beneficiary designation trumps what the will and estate planning documents state. So she went without having that life insurance benefit, which really hurt her. So I think it's important to constantly have those conversations. Dave, I mean, you've seen in your career, you sit down
Yeah.
with a new client and you say, when's the last time you've had your estate plan updated? And they're 65 years old looking to retire. And they say, well, I think we still have our guardians for our minor children listed. So they've gone 30, 40 years without updating the estate plan. Has anything changed since then? I would imagine that, look, when I got married, we had an estate plan established. The minute we had our daughter, we had a new estate plan established because now things have changed. So, um, and Dave, do you have anything you
Yeah,
want to?
and I think it's not just having the estate plan. Also consider your IRAs, your 401ks. Have you taken a look in a while at who those beneficiaries are? Very similar. They're if especially if this is very common in second or more marriages, where you don't update the beneficiary, and you have, as Bryson alluded to, an ex-girlfriend is there, or a different spouse, or a spouse that's deceased. A lot of people don't realize this. If you have your spouse is predeceased you and they're still on there, it has to go through their estate. Oftentimes, if you don't have contingent beneficiaries listed, in order for your children or other heirs to receive access. So it's a very simple one that just crosses people forget about, excuse me, quite often, because it's very basic. And the other part is just not having an estate plan at all. It's not a pleasant conversation to have. Nobody really wants to shell out a couple hundred or a couple $1,000s for one. So they kick the can down the road until unfortunately it's too late. Now, another thing that we see, and I know I have personal experience with it, is adding in children to accounts and property. Bryson, I'll let you start with that one.
Yeah, actually, and Dave, I know you have a story you want to share
Yeah.
about that too. I recently had someone call me up and said, "Hey, so and so passed away, but the good news is I'm added to their house. I'm on the deed to their house. I'm on their checking account." And while at the base level they thought that was great, now we have some challenges. So their mother bought a house back in the 60s. I think they bought it for about $50,000, and it's now worth 350, 400,000. So unfortunately, because he was added to that deed, he assumes that cost basis. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but he now has to pay on the gains of that $400,000 home, which is $350,000. So at capital gains rate, he's probably paying 50 some $1,000s in taxes. If mom would have said, "Hey, instead of adding you to the deed, I'm just going to have you as a power of attorney. You can do anything you need to, you can make financial decisions. But when I pass away in Pennsylvania, all you're going to have to do is pay state inheritance tax, which is 4.5%. So 4.5% on $400,000 is a lot less than 15% on $350,000 of gain. It's a roughly $35,000 tax savings. So
Yeah, and while that's a great, it's a great thought and it's a great idea, and many people want to do it, in part sometimes to try to shield the assets from assisted living facilities. But one of the things they don't realize is that you open yourself up to a lot of risk. If there's a divorce or a lawsuit against one of the children that you put on these accounts, they can now come after that property. So that's something you want to be very careful of. when it comes to that. You know, it's protecting yourself, at the same time. If you'd like to go into the missing guardianship.
Yeah, and I think, to Dave's previous point, when you're missing an estate plan, you're already paying for, most attorneys have um, a package for power of attorney, advanced medical directive, living will, and last will and testament. So you're already shelling out the money for an estate plan. Go ahead and name that financial power of attorney, and they can still help out with the checking account, etc. We did receive a question on the 5-year look back. If I'm reading the question correctly, how does a 5-year look back? How does that look if you add your child to the account or uh, a house to protect on the 5-year look back for nursing home? If that's the question that you're asking, it does help if you add a child to your house. The drawbacks could be, as long as you own the house for 5 years, the child's been added for 5 years, it does help with asset protection. The drawback is, what happens if that child ends up in a divorce and now potentially that equity from the house is in the divorce proceedings? What happens if that child has a car accident and there's a lawsuit? Is the house considered part of that lawsuit? So there's other ways for asset protection that we can include an elder care attorney to help with protecting assets for the home, but typically we recommend that we don't add children to the account. The next bullet point is about missing guardianship for minor children. I have a child that's under a year old, so this kind of near and dear to my heart. Occupational hazard, right? Brooke was born in February. We had updated guardianships and powers of attorney in March. And so often what happens is, it's a terrible conversation to have. If something happens to both parents, you have to name somebody. And if you don't, the outcome is that both sets of grandparents, if they want to raise the child, have to go to orphans court. And I have actually seen in my career where the two different sets of grandparents, are fighting in a full-on legal battle to see who can get custody of their grandchild. My recommendation is, you and your spouse sit down, look over who you think would be the best guardian for your child. It doesn't have to be a grandparent. It doesn't have to be a brother or sister-in-law. It can be whoever you choose, and you name them. And best practice is, at least every attorney that I've spoke to, talk to that potential guardian in advance. Is this something that you would be interested in? Is this something that you'd be able to help us out with?
And something that as we move on to the ignoring your digital presence, it's this is a tough one because it's very easy. I mean, I know I can barely remember all the passwords and so forth. And so should something happen, I mean, we just lived through this literally this past weekend with my mother-in-law who was in the hospital, and all of her, and she's from upstate New York, and my wife was asking, where are your passwords? They're in a notebook in New York, which did not help when we were trying to help with the finances and everything that she has going on. And it just turns into a real big hassle, quite frankly. So make sure that you have them written down, you have them somewhere, and that you give them, more importantly, you give them to somebody that you trust. So should something happen where you become incapacitated for whatever reason, in the hospital, or when somebody needs to help you out with access, they have the ability to do that. So that's something that is more and more common nowadays.
Yeah, we actually just had a client pass away not too long ago, and there was recurring distribution set up on outside accounts for different checks and auto pays. And the surviving spouse called and said, I can't get the auto distributions on his checking account to stop. And she didn't have a death certificate yet, but they needed the payments to stop. She didn't know where the passwords were. So it can be a little bit of a challenge. So I do think that it's beneficial for at least at a minimum spouses to say, here are my passwords. Here's where everything's stored. Personally, what Susie and I do is once a month, and I wrote about this in my most recent Finance Hound column, but we sit down and I know nothing's more romantic than getting tacos, but Susie and I get tacos on the last Thursday of every month.
I thought you were going to say Tuesday.
And we have a discussion about where we're at in our finances. Did we open any new accounts? If we did we add it to our log of where our passwords and usernames are so that if something does happen, you end up in the hospital, you can't log in and make payments, your spouse knows. And at some point, I do have a backup that if both Susie and I are incapacitated, that somebody else knows where everything is and they can take over. So that I think that's critical because it avoids a lot of headaches.
It does. It does. Almost second to not having a estate plan, a huge mistake that I have seen for decades in the industry is people that come to us and they say, no, we ask them about their estate plan. No, I'm all set. I've got a trust. I went to the attorney. We've got the trust. All the beneficiaries are laid out. I know where all my assets are going, except they never, all their accounts are still in their own name. They're in their joint name. It's not in the name of the trust. This is a huge mistake that people make and don't realize it until it's too late. Having failing to fund a trust is it's the equivalent. Having a trust with no assets named in it is the equivalent of having a checking or savings account with no money. Great, you have a checking or savings account. You got to that step. If you don't fund it, it might as well not exist. And unfortunately, we see that a lot, especially with seniors. They'll open the trust based on a seminar. They'll pay the $1,000 to $5,000, whatever it happens to be, but then they don't do anything with it. So that's great that you're protected, but only the assets that are actually funded in the trust are going to where the trust should go.
Right.
And as Bryson mentioned earlier, with the beneficiaries, you can have, the beneficiaries for IRAs and life insurance, or even if you open up a payable on death addendum on your individual or joint account, that supersedes your will and your trust if it's not inside the trust.
Now, that being said, you can name your life insurance. If something happens to Susie and I at the same time in a car accident, I don't want Brooke to inherit all of our assets at this stage. So I actually have my contingent beneficiary on all of my assets going to a trust for the benefit of Brooke. I think a big thing for failing to fund a trust, Dave, a couple years ago, we had a client. The main goal they had was they had a beach home outside of Pennsylvania. I know, surprised it's outside of Pennsylvania. They had a beach home outside of Pennsylvania, which means when they pass away, they have two probates. They had one in Delaware and one in Pennsylvania. So under their estate plan, they opened a trust. They funded that trust, or so they thought they funded that trust with their beach home to avoid Delaware probate. Long story short, when they passed away, their whole goal was to make their children's life easier. One probate in Pennsylvania. By failing to fund that, now the children had to go through probate in Delaware as well. So it was just extra effort for their children. If they would have simply funded the trust, it would have avoided that.
Moving on to the choosing to the wrong executor or trustee. A big one is, do you have somebody that can handle it? That wants to be in that position to be executor or trustee? What are some of the mistakes you've seen?
Well, I think the big mistake is everyone assumes that the oldest child has to be the executor or the trustee, or it has to stay in the family. And so sometimes what I see with younger clients, they say, hey, look, mom and dad, I trust them. I'm going to name them as the trustee for my account. Okay, that's great. If something happens to you, you have somebody you trust. But you just named a trustee that's going to be the trustee of a will for, or a trust for 30 years for your child, and they're 85 years old. Would it maybe make sense to have a sister who's your age? Or would it make sense to you have a cousin that is a financial advisor that wants to help out for you? So it's not just about it has to be the oldest child. It could be the youngest child that has the strongest financial sense or has a background in it.
I'll just use the my family as an example. While I'm the certified financial planner and do everything here, my brother actually has a better legal background, uh, and it makes more sense for him to be the executor. I think we're co-executors on the estate because the oldest child
Yep, yep,
thing with my parents was big, and they named my brother, who's a physical therapist, as their medical
right.
power of attorney. So, it's just knowing, looking at it more pragmatically as to who's the best to serve. Now, you mentioned the lack of the other bullet points. What are some of those things, choosing the wrong executor or trustee impact?
Yeah, and so we did a lot where we sprinkled that throughout all the different stories. And I think when it comes to naming a guardian, naming children to property, not updating a estate plan, those have major tax consequences. I think the big thing is understanding the exposure to creditor liability in all of these different scenarios, and sometimes having incorrect asset transfer because of those things. So, a great example that I'm going to provide is if you name the wrong executor to your account, someone who is just a quick decision maker and they don't do the research, they could move too quickly. They could distribute all the assets out to the beneficiaries. Who's upset about that? Well, they're upset whenever the final tax is due and there's not enough money in the estate. And now the Department of Revenue in the state of Pennsylvania is sending the beneficiaries a letter saying you owe X amount back to the Treasury.
Right.
So, Dave,
Now, yeah, we're moving on to the common budgeting errors. I mean, a lot of these, we're not going to spend a lot of time here, just because a lot of this are just good reminders. Just things that, like the lack of an emergency fund. There are a lot of folks that is the priority until all of a sudden something happens. Do you have a potentially a home equity line of credit that you can use as a last resort? Are you putting enough aside for worst case scenarios? That's a big one. Being too rigid with your budget and not adjusting. Things change. Inflation. What you could buy even 10 years ago for $5 doesn't go nearly as far, 2,500 as it does now. So are you adjusting with inflation and what's going on in the economy in the world? Russ?
yeah, Dave, maybe I know we had talked
Mhm.
earlier before we did this presentation, but we had talked about sometimes an emergency fund,
Mhm.
not having one can be pretty detrimental. And so one example we have is I had a client who they wanted to get as much return as possible. And they said, we want to invest all of our assets. We don't want to have more than $5,000 in our checking and savings combined. That's not our recommendation. Life does not happen in a linear fashion. There are surprises. And what ended up happening is now they have to pull money out of the stock market every time there's a breakdown on their car. They were running a little more expensive this month and they ran their credit card up. And so what happens is you're forced to sell stocks at high points where there's tax obligations, or maybe even a more severe situation where the stock market's down and they're forced to sell when valuations aren't as attractive. But Dave, I think the biggest one in this line is the over and underestimating expenses, especially when it comes to financial planning, don't you?
Yes, for sure. If if you overestimate what your actual income is going to be, maybe you're waiting on that bonus, maybe you're waiting on an inheritance, things along those lines, those can be absolutely detrimental. And the other part is underestimating what your actual expenses are. Because a lot of people will think about the big ticket items. What's my mortgage? What's my car? They don't think about the fact that, well, geez, we go out to eat probably 3 or 4 times a month, and that's another $1,000, depending on where they go. They're not thinking about vacations and how much those actually cost. So now they dig themselves either into debt, or because they go into their their portfolio where they have to sell, and sometimes inopportune times.
Right. And so oftentimes when we're communicating with our financial planning team and we're coordinating with clients, I would rather be a little bit on the conservative side, right? I mean, what's the saying
100%.
that you always say?
Oh, you don't steal my thunder. It's you want you want your assets to outlive you as opposed to you outliving your
Right.
assets.
So whenever we're thinking about um, projecting into the future, we want to make sure that we build in some conservative assumptions, that we aren't completely um, counting on we have to get this bonus, and if we don't, we really have to squint to make things work.
Exactly.
So
Now, do you want to cover the question
I
that
think
or
we
you
can
want
cover. We
that
got
next
another
slide?
question come in that Dave's referencing, but I think that's going to be really pertinent to the next slide. Is there anything else on the common budgeting
No,
question?
like I said, we didn't want to spend too much time here because a lot of it is just, do you have a budget? Have you taken everything into consideration? And is it realistic?
And not forgetting about it.
Yes.
So moving on to some retirement pitfalls, and I think this will be kind of the meat and potatoes of today. The big problem that we see when it comes to retirement planning is ignoring the impact of inflation. And a lot of people say, well, we'll put in 2% and that's good, right? We need to have that conversation about I had a client who worked at the state and they had between pension and social security when they retired, they were going to make roughly the same take home as they would if they were still working. And I had another client that was with the federal government, same situation. Between pension and social security, they were going to make roughly the same amount. But they had very little set aside outside of the pension and the social security. And what we looked at was yes, there's going to be a cost of living adjustment on social security, but there wasn't for either of their pensions. So while the first 10 years of retirement looked great, as inflation crept in over those years, it started to eat away at their spending power or their ability to meet their monthly goals. So prior to both of them retiring, we had them start to save into their 401ks, start to save into Roth IRAs to build up these what we considered inflation offsets. So we used more stock exposure to get a higher rate of return and offset that inflationary number. Uh, we had a gentleman reach out with a question about is there an advantage to taking a monthly drawdown versus an annual drawdown versus a quarterly drawdown? Oftentimes, and it truly is a personal preference is the actual answer. But oftentimes what we find is a monthly distribution tends to work better. It allows us to have flexibility and make changes and adjustments as needed on a more incremental level. But also there's less market timing in. And what I mean by that is we're not forced to take distributions, okay, on the 15th of every month of the first quarter. And if it happens to be a high or a low, that has an impact. Where if it's monthly, it's kind of spacing it out, kind of dollar cost averaging it out. So I found that typically that tends to work a little bit better.
So as we look into, failing to diversify your portfolio, that's another big one. Maybe there's a lot of company stock from before you retired, or you inherited a stock, or you were lucky enough to have something like Apple or Nvidia that has quadrupled or more in price, and you just want to hold on to it for whatever reason. Um, that can be absolutely detrimental. You think back to 2008, where a lot of folks from Bear Stearns, they had multiple millions of dollars, and overnight they went from being able to retire tomorrow to now having to work for another 10 to 15 years to make up for that. Another part with failing to diversify your portfolio is taking on too much risk, and just as detrimental is being too conservative. It's where you can't, because you're ignoring the impact of inflation. There's that lazy math that's out there that I've heard from when I started in the industry. You take your age, your 100 minus your age, and that's how much you should have in bonds. Not necessarily. How much do you actually need the funds? I mean, we have clients that are in their 80s and 90s that are in aggressive portfolios because the purpose of those assets is for their heirs. It's not necessarily for them to live off of. And it's the same thing as being too risky. If we suddenly hit a 2 or 3 year downturn, and all of a sudden your portfolio is cut in half, and you need to live on those assets, you have a much higher, you don't have the time to make up for that risk that you're taking.
I think when it comes to diversifying portfolios, we've seen throughout history various companies, and we don't have to go far back in history. We can go to Silicon Valley Bank, Enron. You talked about Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers. So there's challenges that occur, and we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. I think going back to your lazy math comment, too often I think people look at their allocation and they do a 60-40 split because that's what Kramer said on TV, or their buddy three houses down told them this is what they should do. And often I think what's missing is, let's look at the specific situation for each person. And I mean, you said it earlier, but I have clients that are in their 80s that are 100% stock exposure, and their goal is to grow their assets to provide a larger inheritance. But I have other clients that are much younger that have a portion carved off to
Mhm.
bond because they have a 2 year goal or a 3 year goal, and it doesn't make sense for them to have that portion of their money tied up in the stock market. They need to have it available with a maturity date in 2 years. So we set up a bond portfolio that collect their interest, comes due, and then they can buy their home or whatever college goal they may have. Um, I think the other big thing with failing to diversify a portfolio is, I was just working with a prospective client who has about 40% of their net worth in one stock. And they told me, "Hey, we know this is a problem. We don't even know where to start." And I think sometimes the biggest thing is to stop digging the hole, right? So what we did first step was turn off dividend reinvestment. So they're not buying more Apple stock. They're not buying more Rite Aid stock, whatever company that they're invested in. Other clients have had a very, very large um, concentrated position in their employer stock. And while it can be very attractive to continue to buy at a discount through the employee stock purchase plan, it may make sense to put that on a pause until you can get your allocation rediversified over time. Um, Dave, I know we wanted to talk about accounting for healthcare costs. You want to touch base on that?
Sure, I think that's a big one that people, when they go through their plan, they don't realize how quickly healthcare costs are rising, or they just don't factor into it at all. I'm sure you have examples of clients, multiple, where the financial plan is great until something happens. It's like that old Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until they're punched in the face. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's the healthcare costs, and when something happens and not able to being able to adjust on the fly, um, that causes the biggest strain on a lot of retirement accounts.
Or just retiring before 65, having a plan in place prior to hitting Medicare age is critical. And so for certain clients, that may mean saving a certain amount in cash and using assets that are not considered income to keep your income low enough that you're on the exchange. Some of that may mean only one spouse retiring so that you're still maintaining employer provided benefits. Um, Prior to having somebody retired before Medicare age, I like to bring in a Medicare consultant and a healthcare consultant to talk about what's the right plan for each couple, each family, because it is a critical cost and it's several $1,000s a month to have insurance in place.
Mhm. Now, as we go to the final bullet point, one of the things, if you're not planning for longevity, um, it may, whether it runs in your family or not. So, I've met with clients where most folks, most of their family don't last or don't live past 85. I've met with others where their great aunt is 102 and shows no signs of slowing down. Um, but a lot of people will underestimate how long they're actually anticipated, how long they anticipate to live. And to the point where, 25, 30 years ago, 85, somebody passing away at 82, 83 years old, it seemed like a long time. Now it's like, wow, they were only 80 when they were only 83, and it's a little bit of a surprise. So that's part of why one of the things that we do here at Fort Pitt is we run all of our financial plans for both prospects, prospective clients, and clients. We run it out to the age 100 because if you have too much money when it's left over, it's a great problem to have. And as Bryson alluded to earlier, it was much more important to outlive your assets than to have your assets outlive you. Excuse me, I always get that confused. Rather than have you outlive your assets. Um, that's because that's detrimental because that's when you start having to rely on family or really having to cut down on what your lifestyle what you'd want and having less options should emergency healthcare needs rise.
Yeah, I think it's critical to analyze both maximizing your current lifestyle without jeopardizing long-term financial security. And so by running the projections out to age 100, we can look at what does it look like at age 85? What does it look like at age 90? What does it look like at age 100? And going back to a previous point about inflation, you really start to see the impact of inflation when you start to go out 20, 25, 30 years into the future. So I think that's where that longevity planning kind of ties back into looking at inflation, understanding the budget concerns. They all kind of tie together.
So at this point, you may be thinking, okay, well, now what? We've gone through all of these things. What can I do? When Bryson and I were talking about this, we wanted to break it down into three terms of steps. Bryson?
Yeah, so I think the immediate steps, the easy steps, the quick steps that you can check off the box, you can look at your beneficiary designations, right? They trump the will, as we said previously. So make sure that they reflect your wishes. And that's not just your current 401k, that's any outstanding 401ks that are from previous employers. Look at any life insurance policies. Remember that life insurance policy that your parents bought you when you were 2 years old and you've had for 35 years? What's the beneficiary on that? They may have set it up. Dave, to your point earlier in the presentation, do you have a trust and is it funded? Right? So if you have a trust that's through your will fund that trust. But if you have a revocable trust, a living trust, irrevocable trust, those are the types of trusts that need to be funded. Make sure that you've put the assets in there that you talked about with your estate planning attorney or your financial advisor. Another one that you were talking about earlier, Dave, was the list of username and passwords. Have that so that you and your spouse, or you and your partner, or you and your parents know where usernames and passwords are so that if something happens, the bills can still be paid. Any adjustments that need to be made can be made, and you're saving some headaches.
Yeah, and the biggest part is, again, something easy that you can do is if you analyze your budget, take a quick look and make sure that you know what's coming in and what's going out. Again, especially now, you see these apps like Rocket Money because another case in point, to go back to my mother-in-law example, she didn't realize that she had two Amazon accounts. One that was set
Huh.
up to her, yeah, well, that was a surprise too. One set up to her text cell phone
Yeah.
number, and another set up to her email. She was able to cancel one, doesn't know how to get into the other. So again, it goes with the not only the digital, but are you analyzing your budget? Do you know, again, cutting the cord was popular, just to something similar. Cutting the cord was very popular until there were all these streaming services that you forget about. I accidentally, just a shame on me moment, I did not realize I signed up on a trial for Fubo and put it on a rarely used credit card.
Well,
Thought I canceled it. Next thing you know, 10 months later, I realized that
and for it the whole
I've been
time.
paying for Fubo for for quite a while without realizing it. So it's again just analyzing those things, making sure you know where everything's going, just to avoid some of those headaches. As far as the near term steps, schedule a review with your financial advisor. If you don't have one, give us a call. We'd be glad to help you out, and at least get a lot of these near-term steps taken care of for you. Have you consulted? When's the last time you consulted your estate planning attorney for your wills, trusts, and estate plans? Has it been over 4 or 5 years? They should be the next ones to call, to get all this taken care of, to say, geez, are there any new laws that could impact my estate plan? Who are my beneficiaries? Does that need to be updated? Do you have an executor on there that may no longer be in favor?
I mean, personally, I call my attorney once a year and just say, hey, this is my annual update with you. Is there anything that I need to explore changing? And it's a 5 minute phone call. Sometimes he says no. Sometimes he says, hey, we should probably get a lunch, sit down, talk about it, see if there's any changes based on this. Um, the one time I didn't ask if there was a change, I called and said, hey, I'm having a kid. We need to update things. So if you don't have an attorney that you work with and you need a referral, we work with a lot of great attorneys, happy to point you in the right direction. Longer term, it'll be important to update your estate plan and your financial plan. So while you have the immediate terms of talking with your advisor, I think it is critical to dust off the financial plan, go through a deep dive. That means including checking all outstanding balances. That means checking your budget. That means revamping your goals, having that. What I've always found to be the most productive conversation is when a couple has a conversation prior to sitting down with the financial advisor and saying, these are our goals. This is what we want to achieve. We need help figuring out how to get there. And then the same thing with your estate planning attorney. Have an idea, and I talk to clients about this all the time. Um, let's talk about what your goal is from inheritance. Let's talk about what your goal is with your money when you are no longer with us. And sometimes that is, I want to help my adult children, or I want my grandchildren, or I want to help my child buy their first home. So help kind of think through what your goals are, and then let's sit down and chat. And we did just have a person reach in and ask if we work with clients in Maryland. We are registered to work with clients in all 50 states of the United States. So we can help anyone. Don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. And we have a pretty vast network of attorneys and accountants throughout the different states as well.
The nice part about having a firm the size of ours is, we get emails from other financial advisors, partners, saying, do you know an attorney out in Las Vegas or Los Angeles, or Connecticut? And generally, somebody I was actually able to help Bryson out,
Oh,
being
Boston.
being from Massachusetts. I was able to get him in to put him in touch with a real estate attorney that I'd knew and used in the past. So we have a very vast network for all 50 states.
We did get a quick question on vacation homes, and no, you can back it up. So there are a lot of different inquiries on vacation homes, and there's a lot of different ways to handle it. Um, so vacation home being left. So a vacation home, it's going to depend on how it's titled, if it's a rental property or if it's individually owned. But that can often be, if it's in a different state, used in a as a trust. So have a trust established to help avoid any outside ancillary probate. Um, Depending on the unrealized gain in the property, it may make sense to sell it. It's going to depend on the goals, and I know a lot of times when we talk
Yeah.
about real estate, maybe chat about, do you want to own that? Do the kids even want it?
Yeah, I think that's a
Loaded
requires a
question.
much, well, it's not a loaded question, but it requires a much longer conversation as opposed to a yes or no. And that is something that we can definitely discuss probably offline if you'd like, because it depends on so many different factors.
Yeah, and I think the first question I would have is talking to children, is this something that you even want?
Hmm.
If you want it, then we can go down
Can they
a
care for
certain,
it? Yeah.
yeah. If they don't want it, then the answer is simple: liquidate it.
Yeah.
So we're kind of wrapping up on time here. I wanted to point out that we do have another deep dive into estate planning February 18th, so keep an eye out for that. Emails have been going out, but if you want to sign up, just let me know and I'll make sure to get a reservation for you, get you the link. We really appreciate your time signing on and listening to kind of some of the pitfalls of retirement planning and how to avoid them. Dave, thanks for joining me today.
Yep.
We had a lot
That
of fun.
was great.
And if you guys need anything, don't hesitate to reach out to either one of us and look forward to having a deeper conversation.
Thank you.